In a prison on a harsh desert planet, Jaxon Holt's world is turned upside down when he finds himself caught in the deadly web of Klythar authority. Despite being a hardened ex-mercenary, he's left with little more than his defiance as the guards work to break him. But things take an unexpected turn when a stunning Klythar medic, Zyra Velith, steps into his cell, tasked with healing him. Caught between duty and her growing curiosity, Zyra begins to question everything: her role in the Klythar Empire and the connection she feels for the very prisoner she was supposed to break. As their worlds collide, Jaxon and Zyra must decide whether to fight for freedom or fall into a dangerous new bond that neither can escape. Want to see where their forbidden bond leads? Don't miss out on the rest of their story. Subscribe now for more thrilling chapters. The Aeron Virus 7 was a gritty cocktail of dust and despair, the kind that clung to your lungs like a bad breakup. Outside the prison's walls, crimson sandstorms howled, tearing at the jagged peaks of the mining cliffs. Inside, it wasn't much better, a labyrinth of cold steel and flickering lights, where the hum of drilling rigs echoed like a heartbeat. The Klythar had built this place, a fortress carved into the desert to guard their precious crystallis mines, glowing gems that powered their tech and their egos. To them, humans are just vermin, scurrying pests to be caged or crushed. And Jaxon Holt? He was the pest they couldn't quite squash. Blood dripped from his split lip, painting a lazy trail down his chin as two Klythar guards dragged him through a corridor. His wrists burned where the cuffs bit into his skin, but Jaxon kept his head up, smirking through the pain. "You guys ever think about redecorating?" he rasped, voice hoarse but dripping with defiance. "This old tortured dungeon chic is a bit last century." The taller guard, scales glinting like polished jade under the lights, snarled. "Keep talking, human. Makes it easier to break you." "Break me?" Jaxon chuckled, wincing as they yanked him harder. "Buddy, I'm already in pieces. You're just rearranging the puzzle." They shoved him into a sterile chamber, the air sharp with antiseptic and ozone. The room was a sci-fi nightmare, walls lined with blinking monitors, a slab-like med table at the center, and a faint glow from a device humming overhead. The guards flung him onto the table, his back slamming against the cold metal. He grunted, but bit back a curse, forcing another grin. 5 stars for hospitality. Where's the mint on my pillow?" "Still breathing, this one," the second guard muttered, his voice a low hiss. "Tougher than he looks." "Or dumber," the first growled. He leaned close, breath reeking of something like burnt oil. "Enjoy the doc, human. She's got a way of cutting deep." Jaxon arched a brow, unfazed. "What? No dinner first? I'm wounded, literally." The door hissed open before the guard could swing a fist, and a new presence silenced the room. She stepped in, moving with a grace that didn't belong in this hellhole. Zyra Velith, Klythar medic, was a vision that could stop hearts or restart them. Her skin shimmered like liquid silver, catching the light in waves, and her eyes burned with an amber glow, like twin suns trapped in a storm. Long black hair spilled over her shoulders, framing a face that was equal parts angel and assassin. Her uniform hugged curves that Jaxon's brain, despite the pain, couldn't ignore. She was beautiful, sure, but it was the kind of beauty that felt like a warning. "Out," she said, voice crisp as a blade. The guards hesitated, glancing at each other. "Now." They obeyed, but not before the taller one sneered at Jaxon. "Have fun, me." The door sealed shut, leaving a heavy silence. Zyra approached the table, her boots clicking against the floor. She didn't look at him, not yet, her fingers dancing over a console that sprang to life with holographic readouts. Jaxon tilted his head, studying her. "So, you the welcoming committee? Gotta say, you're an upgrade from the goon squad." She ignored him, eyes fixed on the data streaming across the screen. Heart rate, erratic. Blood pressure, spiking. Bruises mapped his torso like a star chart. Cracked ribs, internal swelling, the works. She tapped a control, and a sleek device descended from the ceiling, its lenses whirring as it scanned him. "You're lucky to be alive," she said, voice flat. "Most don't last this long. Lucky's my middle name. Jaxon quipped, shifting on the table despite the pain. Well, that and reckless. Depends on who you ask. Her gaze flicked to him, sharp and unamused, but there was something else there, a flicker of curiosity, maybe. She stepped closer, pulling a handheld scanner from her belt. The device hummed as she ran it over his chest, its light painting his skin in soft blues. Jackson's breath hitched when her fingers brushed his neck, adjusting the scanner's angle. Her touch was cool, like moonlight on steel, but it sent a jolt through him, sharp and electric. His heart monitor beeped louder, betraying him. Zyra's brows furrowed, her eyes darting to the screen. "It's rising," she murmured, almost to herself. She paused, then met his gaze, her voice low, deliberate. "Should I reach for it?" Jackson's lips curled into a slow, mischievous grin. "Doc, you reach for whatever you want. I'm an open book, battered, but still a bestseller." Her expression didn't change, but her eyes lingered on him a fraction too long. She adjusted the scanner, her fingers grazing his neck again, slower this time. The monitor beeped insistently, and Jaxon chuckled. "That's not the pain talking, is it? Or do Klythar scanners just tickle?" "It's a neuropulse anomaly," she said, ignoring his bait. But her hand didn't move right away, and he felt the warmth of her skin, faint but undeniable, like a star's glow through a haze. "Your body's reacting unusually." Unusually, he leaned forward slightly, voice dropping to a playful murmur. "Careful, you're going to make me blush. And I'm already short on blood." Zyra stepped back, breaking the moment, her face a mask of control. But Jaxon saw it. The way her fingers tightened around the scanner, the slight shift in her posture. She wasn't as detached as she wanted to be. He filed that away, right next to the pain screaming in his ribs. Outside, Virus 7 raged on. The prison sat like a scar on the planet's face, its towers stabbing into a sky choked with red dust. The Klythar had turned this world into a machine, stripping chrysalis from its veins to fuel their empire. The gems glowed like frozen fire, powering everything from starships to neural implants. But they came at a cost. Human lives, mostly. Slaves, prisoners, rebels like Jaxon, all chewed up by the mines or the guards' fists. The Klythar saw themselves as gods, their silver skin and glowing eyes proof of superiority. Humans? Barely worth the air they breathed. Jackson's mind flickered to the past, to the Starlance, his old ship, now a wreck somewhere in the void. He'd been a free pilot once, running jobs across the galaxy, dodging Klythar patrols with a grin and a prayer. His crew, Rhea, Marco, little Tess, had been family. They'd trusted him to lead, to keep them safe. But the data he'd stolen, proof of Klythar bioweapons, had cost them everything. The ambush came fast, plasma tearing through the Starlance like paper. He saw Tess's face last, her eyes wide before the dark took her. Jackson's jaw clenched. He'd made a promise that day. Burn their empire down or die trying. Zyra's voice pulled him back. "Hold still." She was bandaging a gash on his arm now, her movements precise but not gentle. Her fingers brushed his hand as she secured the wrap, and he felt that jolt again, like a spark jumping a circuit. He turned his hand just enough to graze her knuckles, deliberate but light. She froze, her eyes snapping to his. "Whoops," he said, all innocence, but his grin was pure trouble. Slippery fingers. Hazard of the trade. She pulled her hand away, but not before he caught the faintest flush in her silver cheeks, a shimmer like starlight on water. "You're reckless," she said, voice clipped. "And you're curious," he shot back, leaning back on the table. "Admit it, Doc. I'm the most interesting lab rat you've got." Zyra didn't answer, but her silence spoke volumes. Her mind was elsewhere, tangled in memories she didn't share. Years ago, she'd been a rising star in Klythar science, designing neural tech that could save lives. But the Council had other plans, experiments on humans, tearing minds apart to perfect their weapons. She'd protested, saved one prisoner from the labs, and paid for it with her rank. Now she was here, patching up rebels and dodging the Council's eyes. Jaxon was just another case, or he should have been. But the way his heart spiked when she touched him, the way he looked at her like she was more than a jailer, it stirred something she'd buried long ago. The door hissed, and a new figure stepped in. Kren, a Klythar guard with a face like a storm cloud. His scales were duller than Zyra's, his eyes a cold green that sized Jaxon up like prey. He'd been her colleague once, back when they both believed in the system. Now he watched her like a hawk, resentment simmering in every glance. "Status," he barked, ignoring Jaxon. "Stable," Zyra said, not looking up. "Minor fractures, lacerations." "He'll live," Kren snorted, stepping closer to the table. "This one's trouble. Council wants him broken, not coddled." Jaxon piped up, all cheer. "Ah, Kren, you jealous? Don't worry, I'll save you a dance." Kren's hand twitched toward his baton, but Zyra's voice cut through, icy and final. "Leave. He's under my care." Kren's eyes narrowed, lingering on her. "Careful, Velith. You're on thin ice already." The door sealed behind him, and Jaxon let out a low whistle. "Wow, he's a ray of sunshine. Old boyfriend." Zyra's glare could have melted steel. "Focus on surviving, human." "Jaxon," he corrected, grinning. "And trust me, surviving's my specialty. But you," he tilted his head, voice softening just enough to catch her off guard. "Your eyes glow like those crystals out there. But they've seen some stories." She turned away, busying herself with the console, but her fingers faltered for a split second. Jaxon leaned back, ignoring the ache in his bones. The room was cold, the monitors still beeping, but something warm sparked in the air between them. A dangerous, reckless thing neither could name. Not yet. Somewhere above, a system hummed to life. Vox, the prison's AI, watched through hidden lenses, its voice silent, but its data streams alive. Subject: Holt, J. Anomaly detected. Observer: Velith, Z. Emotional variance: 78% above baseline. It logged the moment, filed it away. Neither Jaxon nor Zyra noticed, too caught in their own dance. A pilot with nothing to lose, and a medic who'd forgotten how to feel. Outside, the sandstorm screamed, and Virus 7 kept turning, indifferent to the fire starting below. The prison on Virus 7 didn't sleep. Its corridors buzzed with the hum of machinery, the clank of boots, and the ever-present whine of crystallus drills gnawing at the planet's core. The air was thick, heavy with the tang of metal and sweat, and every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Jaxon Holt felt it all. The ache in his bones, the sting of fresh bruises, the weight of eyes that never stopped watching. But he wasn't dead yet, and that was a win in his book. They dragged him back to the med bay 2 days after his first meeting with Zyra Velith, his boots scraping the floor as the Klythar guards gripped his arms like vices. His shirt was torn, blood seeping through where a baton had kissed his ribs too hard. Jackson's head lolled, but his grin stayed sharp, a blade he wielded even when his body screamed. "You guys ever try yoga?" he rasped, voice rough as gravel. "Might loosen you up. You're wound tighter than a neutron star." "Shut it, human," the shorter guard snapped, scales glinting dully under the flickering lights. "You're lucky the doc wants you breathing." "Lucky?" Jaxon chuckled, wincing as they jerked him forward. "Yeah, I'm living the dream. Penthouse suite, 5-star beatings. Where do I leave my tip?" They shoved him through the medbay door, and he stumbled, catching himself against the wall. The room was the same sterile cage, monitors blinking like judgmental eyes, the med table gleaming like an altar for sacrifice. The guards didn't linger this time, just dumped him and left, their laughter echoing down the hall. Jaxon straightened, ignoring the fire in his side, and scanned the room. Empty, except for the hum of tech and the faint glow of a crystallus shard embedded in the console, pulsing like a trapped heart. Then she was there. Zyra Velith stepped out from a side alcove, her silver skin catching the light like a polished blade. Her amber eyes locked onto him, sharp and unreadable, but there was a tension in her posture, a crack in her usual ice. Her hair fell in dark waves, framing a face that could have launched 1,000 ships or burned them to ash. She moved toward him, each step deliberate, her uniform clinging to her like a second skin. Jackson's pulse kicked up, and he wasn't sure if it was the pain or something else. Well, he said, leaning against the table with a smirk. Miss me, Doc? Or is this just my face's fault for being so damn memorable? Sit, she ordered, voice crisp but not unkind. She gestured to the table, already pulling a scanner from her belt. You're a mess. Flattering as always. He eased himself onto the table, grimacing as his ribs protested. But I'm guessing you didn't call me back for my sparkling conversation. Zyra didn't answer, her focus on the scanner as it hummed to life. She ran it over his torso, the light revealing a map of damage. Bruises blooming like galaxies, a fracture snaking across his fourth rib. Her fingers brushed his hip as she adjusted the scanner, and Jackson's breath caught, a spark racing through him like a live wire. Her touch was clinical, precise, but it lingered a heartbeat too long, warm against his battered skin, like sunlight breaking through a storm. Whoa there, he said, voice low and teasing. You keep touching me like that, I'm gonna think you're flirting. Her hand froze, and she looked up, eyes narrowing. I'm assessing your injuries. Sure you are. He caught her wrist, gentle but firm, his thumb grazing her pulse point. But your scanner's not the only thing picking up signals, sweetheart. Zyra pulled her hand free, but not before he felt the faintest tremor in her fingers. Her silver skin shimmered, a ripple of light that betrayed her calm. You're delusional, she said, turning to the console to hide her face. But Jackson saw the way her shoulders stiffened, the way she gripped the scanner like a lifeline. Delusional's my brand, he quipped, leaning back. Comes with a pilot gig. Ever hear about the time I outran a Klythar frigate in a rust bucket hauler? True story. Had to dodge plasma bolts the size of my ego. She glanced at him, one brow arched. And yet here you are, cuffed and bleeding. Details. He waved a hand, wincing at the motion. Point is, I'm still kicking, and you're still staring. Zyra's lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't deny it. She stepped closer, pulling a small device from her satchel, a synth link, a palm-sized disc that glowed faintly green. This will monitor your vitals, she said, voice all business. Try not to break it. Monitor me? Jackson tilted his head, grin widening. Doc, if you want to keep tabs, just ask me out. I'm free most evenings. Well, except for the whole prisoner thing. It's medical, she snapped, but her eyes flicked to his, and there was something there, curiosity, maybe, or something hotter. She pressed the synth link to his chest, just below his collarbone. The device hummed, embedding itself with a soft click, and Jackson hissed as it synced with his nerves. But it wasn't just pain he felt. A strange warmth spread from the link, like a thread connecting him to her, and for a split second, he swore he felt her pulse, quick and unsteady. Damn, he muttered, rubbing the spot. That's one hell of a handshake. Zyra didn't respond, her fingers hovering over the console as data streamed in, his heart rate, his pain levels, all spiking under her touch. The synth link wasn't just a tracker. It was a bridge, letting her feel the edges of his agony, his defiance, his something else. She frowned, her silver skin catching the light like a mirror to her thoughts. She'd seen humans break, beg, crumble under less. But Jackson? He laughed through the pain, teased her like they were at a bar, not a prison. It unnerved her, and she hated how much it intrigued her. The door hissed open, shattering the moment. Kren strode in, his green eyes cold as permafrost. He'd been her shadow since her demotion, always watching, always waiting for her to slip. Once, they'd been equals, partners in the labs, dreaming of a better Klythar empire. Now he was a guard, and she was a pariah, and the bitterness between them was a living thing. Velith, he said, voice clipped. Council's asking questions. Why is this human still walking? Zyra didn't flinch, her gaze steady. Because I'm doing my job. Unlike some. Kren's scales bristled, but he stepped closer, lowering his voice. You're too soft on him. They're watching you, Zyra. One wrong move, and you're done. Then let them watch. She shot back, her tone ice cold, but her eyes burning. If you've got nothing better to do, Kren, find someone else to bother. He lingered, his gaze flicking to Jaxon, who gave him a mock salute. "Hey, big guy, love the vibe. You practicing for the Grumpy Cat audition?" Kren's hand twitched, but Zyra stepped between them, her presence a wall. "Out. Now." He left, but the air felt heavier, charged with unspoken threats. Zyra turned back to Jaxon, her face unreadable, but her hands moved faster now, bandaging his wounds with a precision that bordered on anger. Her fingers grazed his shoulder, checking a bruise, and Jackson's hand brushed her hair as he shifted. A fleeting touch, soft as a whisper, but it stopped her cold. Her hair was like silk, dark and endless, and for a moment, he wanted to tangle his fingers in it, pull her closer. "Sorry," he said, not sounding sorry at all, his grin pure mischief. "Guess I'm not used to such attentive care." Zyra's eyes met his, and something flickered there. Danger, desire, a line she wasn't ready to cross. "You're reckless," she said softly, almost an accusation. "In your trouble," he replied, voice low and warm. "The best kind." She turned away, but not before he saw the shimmer in her skin, a pulse of light that wasn't just the room's glow. The synth link hummed against his chest, and he felt it again, that strange connection, like her heartbeat was echoing his own. He didn't know what it meant, but he knew one thing. Zyra Velith wasn't just a doctor, and he wasn't just a prisoner. Not anymore. Hours later, they came for him again. The guards were different this time, their batons hungry for blood. They dragged him to a cell deep in the prison's belly, a concrete box that smelled of rust and despair. Jaxon hit the floor hard, his vision swimming, but he laughed, a dry, broken sound. "You guys need new hobbies," he gasped as they laid into him, boots and fists finding every weak spot. He curled in on himself, protecting the synth link, protecting her. Zyra felt it before she saw it. The synth link flared on her console, a scream of data, pain spiking, vitals crashing. She was in her quarters, a sterile cube barely bigger than a coffin, when the alert hit. Her breath caught, her silver skin prickling as Jackson's agony bled through the link, sharp and raw. She'd calibrated it to monitor, not to feel, but there it was, his stubborn pulse fighting through the dark. She slammed her fist against the console, cursing herself for caring. The prison's AI, Vox, spoke then, its voice a smooth hum in the silence. "Subject Holt, critical condition. Pain threshold exceeded." "Why persist, Velith?" Zyra's jaw tightened. "None of your business," she snapped, shutting the AI down with a flick of her wrist. But Vox's question lingered, a splinter in her mind. Why did she care? She'd seen humans die, seen their defiance crumble to dust. But Jaxon was different. His humor, his fire, the way he looked at her like she was more than a cog in the machine. It was dangerous, and she couldn't stop. She found him in the cell block, blood pooling beneath him, his grin faint but still there. The guards loomed over him, one raising a baton for another strike. Zyra's voice cut through like a laser. "Touch him again, and I report you to the council. All of you." The prison on virus. 7 was a beast that never stopped chewing. Its corridors twisted like veins, pulsing with the grind of machines and the shouts of guards. Deep beneath the surface, where the crystallis mines glowed like trapped stars, the air grew thick, heavy with the weight of secrets. Jaxon Holt knew secrets. He'd stolen one big enough to burn the Klythar Empire down. But right now, his biggest problem was staying upright. His ribs ached, the synth link on his chest hummed like a restless ghost, and every step felt like a bet he might lose. But Jaxon wasn't the quitting type. Not when there was a silver-skinned medic who kept pulling him back from the edge. He was in his cell, a concrete coffin barely wide enough to pace, when the door hissed open. 2 Klythar guards loomed, their scales glinting like oil under the dim lights. "Move, human," one growled, yanking him to his feet. Jaxon stumbled, the synth link flaring with a dull heat, but he flashed a grin sharp enough to cut. "Morning, fellas," he said, voice rough but bright. "What's on the menu? More beatings? Or are we upgrading to waterboarding? I'm a sucker for variety." "Shut it," the other guard snapped, shoving him into the corridor. "Doctor's orders. You're wanted." Jackson's grin widened. though his side screamed with every step. "Doc Velith, huh? Tell me, is she as dreamy in your nightmares as she is in mine?" The guard's baton twitched, but they kept moving, dragging him through a maze of tunnels that smelled of rust and despair. The prison was alive tonight, its walls vibrating with the distant rumble of drills, the air thick with red dust that never settled. Jackson's mind flickered to the Starlance, to the open void where he'd been free, dodging Klythar patrols with a laugh and a prayer. That life was gone, but Zyra? She was here now, and that was enough to keep his blood pumping. They reached a hidden door, unmarked and tucked behind a maintenance shaft. The guard shoved him inside, and Jaxon caught himself against a wall, his breath hitching. The room was no med bay. It was a relic, a forgotten lab buried in the prison's guts. Tubes of bioluminescent fluid snaked along the ceiling, casting an eerie glow, like veins of a sleeping giant. Consoles flickered with half-dead screens, and the air hummed with static, heavy with the scent of ozone and secrets. This wasn't a place for healing. This was where the Klythar broke things, minds, bodies, truths. Zyra stood at the center, her silver skin shimmering under the pulsing light. Her amber eyes flicked to him, sharp and unreadable, but there was a tension in her stance, like a wire pulled too tight. Her hair spilled over one shoulder, dark as a void, and her uniform clung to her curves, a reminder that beauty could be a weapon. She held a device in her hand, a sleek neurosync rig, its wires glinting like spider silk. "Well, damn," Jaxon said, straightening despite the pain. "If this is a date, Doc, you really know how to set the mood. Kreepilabi, glovin tubish romanci central." "Sit," she said, pointing to a chair rigged with sensors. Her voice was clipped, but there was a crack in it, a hint of something raw. "We don't have much time." "Time?" He eased into the chair, wincing as the synth link pulsed. "Thought we had forever. Or at least until the next guard decides I'm a punching bag." She didn't smile, but her eyes softened, just for a second. She stepped closer, the neurosync humming as she attached its nodes to his temples. Her fingers brushed his jaw, cool and deliberate, but the touch sent a spark through him, sharp as a plasma bolt. Jackson's pulse kicked up, the synth link glowing faintly, and he caught her wrist, his grin pure mischief. "Easy, sweetheart," he murmured, voice low and teasing. "You keep touching me like that, I'll forget I'm a prisoner." Zyra's eyes narrowed, but she didn't pull away. "This isn't a game," she said, her voice softer now, almost a warning. "I need to understand you." "Understand me?" He leaned forward, ignoring the ache in his ribs. "I'm an open book, Doc. Dog-eared, coffee-stained, but full of charm. What's the real deal here?" She hesitated, her silver skin catching the light like a mirror to her thoughts. The neurosync beeped, ready to link their minds, and Jaxon saw it in her eyes. Doubt, curiosity, a hunger she couldn't name. She activated the device, and the world shifted. Colors bled into static, then snapped into focus. Jaxon felt her, not just her touch, but her presence, like a tide pulling him under. He saw flashes, Zyra standing before the Klythar Council, her voice breaking as she defied them. A prisoner's hand slipping from hers, cold and still. And she saw him, Jaxon in the Starlant's cockpit, laughing as he spun through a meteor storm. Tessa's face fading in a burst of light, his screams swallowed by the void. "Whoa!" Jaxon gasped, the link fading. His chest heaved, the synth link burning against his skin. "That was intense. You always take eyes on mind melds for a first date." Zyra's breath was uneven, her eyes wide, like she'd seen a ghost. "You're not like the others," she said, almost to herself. "You don't break." "Break?" He chuckled, rubbing his temple. "Nah, I bend. Makes me harder to toss out." She stepped closer, too close, her breath brushing his cheek like a warm wind. Her hand rested on his shoulder, checking a bruise, but her fingers lingered, tracing the edge of his collarbone. Jackson's heart monitor spiked, and he tilted his head, catching her gaze. "You're not just scanning me, are you?" he said, voice low, daring her to admit it. Her silver skin shimmered, a pulse of light that wasn't just the lab's glow. "This is science," she said, but her voice wavered, and her hand didn't move. "Sure it is," Jaxon grinned, his hand brushing her arm, feather-light but deliberate. "Science with a side of something else." The moment hung, heavy and electric, until a distant alarm shattered it. Zyra pulled back, her face a mask again, but her eyes betrayed her, stormy, conflicted. She turned to the console, fingers flying over controls, but Jaxon saw the truth. She was in deeper than she wanted to be. The lab wasn't just a hideout. It was a tomb for Klythar failures. Decades ago, they tried to splice human and Klythar DNA, chasing a perfect soldier. The results were monsters, locked away in these tubes, their screams silenced by time. Zyra had read the files, seen the bodies, and sworn never to cross that line. But Jaxon was different. His defiance, his humor, the way his pulse sang under her touch. It wasn't science driving her now. It was something human, and it scared her. Hours later, the council struck. Jaxon was back in his cell when the guards came, their batons replaced by a mind erase rig, a device that could shred memories like paper. They cuffed him to a chair in a blacked-out room, its walls slick with condensation, the air cold as a grave. Jackson's grin didn't falter, but his stomach twisted. "Gotta say," he quipped, "this setup's giving me bad vibes." "No snacks?" "No mood lighting. Quiet," the lead guard snarled, powering up the rig. Its needles gleamed, ready to carve his mind to nothing. Jaxon leaned back, heart pounding but voice steady. "You know, I've survived worse. Like that time, I flew through a pulsar storm with half a wing. True story. Want to hear it?" The guard didn't answer, but the door exploded open before the needles could bite. Zyra stormed in, her eyes blazing like twin suns. She held a stolen override key, its light flashing as she jammed it into the rig's port. Sparks flew, the device whining as it died. The guards lunged, but Zyra was faster, her Klythar reflexes a blur. She dropped one with a strike to the throat, the other with a kick that cracked scales. Jaxon whistled, still cuffed. "Damn, Doc, you're a regular action hero. Got a cape under that coat." "Shut up," she snapped, freeing his cuffs with trembling hands. Her fingers brushed his wrists, warm and urgent, and he felt the synth-link pulse, tying them together. "We need to move." "Move." He stood, rubbing his wrists, grin unshaken. "Lead the way, princess. I'm all yours." They ran, the prison's alarms screaming like a wounded beast. Corridors blurred past, red lights strobing, boots pounding behind them. Jackson's ribs burned, but he kept pace, his pilot's instincts kicking in. They ducked into a maintenance tunnel, its walls slick with grime, the air hot and tight. Zyra led, her silver skin glowing faintly, a beacon in the dark. Jaxon followed, too close, and when she stopped to check a panel, his hand grazed her waist, steadying her. Her breath hitched, their bodies pressed in the narrow space, and for a moment, the alarms faded. "Careful," he murmured, voice teasing but eyes serious. "You're gonna make me think you like tight spaces." Zyra's eyes flashed, but she didn't pull away. "You're impossible," she said, her voice low, almost a growl. "And you're addictive." He shot back, his hand lingering a second too long before she shoved him forward. The tunnel spat them into a loading bay, where crates of crystallis glowed like frozen fire. Guards swarmed, but Jaxon moved like he was born for chaos. He grabbed a loose pipe, swinging it like a bat, dropping one Klythar with a crack. Zyra fought beside him, her strikes precise, lethal, a dance of silver and fury. They were a team, unspoken, unstoppable. But Kren was watching. He'd followed the alerts, his green eyes cold as he reported to the council. Zyra's override key had tripped a silent alarm, and he knew it. The human was trouble, but Zyra? She was a traitor now, and Kren would make sure she paid. Virus 7 was a planet that chewed up hope and spat out dust. Its crimson storms raged beyond the prison's walls, clawing at the steel like a beast denied its prey. Inside, the labyrinth of tunnels and bays screamed with alarms, a cacophony of red lights, and pounding boots, chasing two sparks who refused to burn out. Jaxon Holt and Zyra Velith were no longer prisoner and doctor. They were rebels, outlaws, a pair of flames dancing on the edge of a void. The synth link on Jackson's chest pulsed with every heartbeat, tying him to her. And as they fled through the prison's underbelly, he felt alive in a way he hadn't since the Starlance sword. They burst from the vent shaft into a hangar bay, a cavern of rust and shadows lit by the eerie glow of crystallis crates. A battered Starcutter ship squatted in the center, its hull scarred from battles older than Jackson's worst mistakes. It was a relic, a smuggler's rig left to rot, but Zyra beelined for it like it was salvation. Jaxon followed, his ribs screaming with every step, but his grin was untouchable, a beacon in the chaos. "Nice ride," he panted, dodging a crate as alarms blared. "You steal it. Or is this your weekend getaway car?" Zyra shot him a look, her amber eyes blazing under sweat-damp hair. "It's our ticket out," she said, vaulting over a railing to reach the ship's hatch. "Unless you'd rather stay for the Council's hospitality." "Tempting," Jaxon quipped, catching up. "But I'm more of a fly now. Regret later guy." She pried open the hatch, her silver skin glinting like a blade in the dim light. The Starcutter's interior was a mess. Wires dangling like vines, seats torn to hell, a cockpit that smelled of oil and desperation. Zyra slid into the pilot's chair, her fingers dancing over controls that flickered to life with a reluctant hum. Jaxon dropped into the co-pilot's seat, his hands already on the secondary panel, muscle memory kicking in from years dodging Klythar patrols. "Engines are cold," Zyra muttered, flipping switches. "This thing hasn't flown in years." "Then let's warm it up," Jaxon said, grin widening as he patched a sparking circuit. "I've sweet-talked worse buckets into the sky." Her lips twitched, almost a smile, gone too fast to catch. The ship groaned, its engines coughing like a dying beast, but stirred. Outside, guards poured into the bay, their shouts drowned by the rising roar. Jaxon glanced at Zyra, her face set in fierce determination, and felt a jolt that wasn't just adrenaline. She wasn't just saving him, she was betting everything on them. "Hold on," she said, yanking the throttle. The Starcutter lurched, scraping the bay floor as it lifted, a drunken bird fighting gravity. Jaxon braced himself, his hand brushing hers on the armrest, warm and fleeting. Her silver skin shimmered, and for a second, their eyes locked, a silent vow in the chaos. "Whoa, Doc," he teased, voice low. "You keep flying like this, I'm gonna fall for you." "Focus," she snapped, but her voice was softer, strained, like she was fighting more than the ship. They cleared the bay, the prison's walls falling away as Virus 7's sky swallowed them. The planet was a furnace of red dust, its storms swirling like blood in water. Zyra pushed the Starcutter higher, aiming for the orbital shield, a lattice of Klythar tech that could fry them in seconds. Jaxon scanned the sensors, his pilot's instincts screaming. "Drones incoming," he said, spotting blips on the radar. 3, no 4. They're not here to wave goodbye. Zyra's jaw tightened, her hands steady on the controls. "Can you jam their targeting?" "Tunniyam them," Jaxon scoffed, already rerouting power to the ship's ancient countermeasures. "Sweetheart, I was jamming Klythar toys before you were stitching up her bells." She didn't reply, but her glance said enough, half exasperation, half something warmer. The Starcutter shuddered as a drone's laser grazed its hull, sparks raining in the cockpit. Jaxon patched another circuit, his fingers flying, while Zyra weaved through the storm, dodging beams that lit the sky like lightning. The shield loomed ahead, a web of blue energy pulsing with menace. "Gonna be tight," Jaxon said, rerouting thrusters. "Ever threaded a needle at Mach 5? "Once," Zyra said, her voice clipped but alive. "Didn't crash. That's my girl." He grinned, ignoring the synthlink's burn. He leaned closer, their shoulders brushing, and felt her tense. Not from fear, but from him. The ship screamed, the shield's edge scraping its belly, and for a moment, they were one wrong move from ash. They broke through, the sky exploding into stars, Virus 7's grip fading below. But the drones were relentless, their missiles trailing fire. Zyra banked hard, the Star Cutter groaning, and Jaxon diverted power to the rear deflectors, his hands a blur. "Come on, baby," he muttered to the ship. "Don't quit on me now." A missile hit, the impact throwing them forward. Zyra's hand slipped, and Jaxon caught it, steadying her, his grip firm but gentle. Her silver skin was warm, alive, and the synth link hummed, tying their pulses together. "Got you," he said, voice steady despite the chaos. She didn't pull away, her eyes meeting his, fierce and unguarded. "Don't let go." "Never," he promised, and meant it. The Star Cutter was dying, its engines coughing blood. Zyra aimed for a canyon beyond the mines, a scar in Virus 7's skin where the storm couldn't reach. The ship hit the ground hard, skidding through red sand, metal tearing like paper. Jaxon braced Zyra, his arm around her, as the cockpit shook, sparks raining like stars. When it stopped, silence fell, heavy and surreal, broken only by their ragged breaths. They stumbled out, the canyon a maze of jagged rock and glowing crystallous veins. The storm howled above, but here it was quiet, the air cool and still. Zyra led him to a cave, its mouth hidden by vines of stone. Inside, crystalline shards studded the walls, casting light like a fractured sky. It was a sanctuary, a secret carved from the planet's heart, and Jaxon felt the weight of it, them settle into his bones. "You okay?" he asked, voice softer now, no jokes to hide behind. His hand grazed her arm, checking for wounds, but it lingered, drawn to her warmth. Zyra nodded, her silver skin catching the crystal light, her eyes stormy but alive. "You? Been worse," he said, but his grin was tired, real. He stepped closer, the cave shrinking around them, and she didn't back away. Her hair fell across her face, and he brushed it aside, his fingers tracing her cheek, slow and deliberate. Her breath hitched, the synth link pulsing like a shared heartbeat, and Jaxon felt the air shift, heavy with something neither could deny. "We shouldn't," she whispered, but her eyes said otherwise, locked on his, burning with want. "Shouldn't's overrated," he murmured, his hand sliding to her neck, thumb grazing her pulse. "You feel it too, don't you?" She didn't answer, not with words. Her hand found his chest, fingers curling over the synth link, and the cave seemed to vanish. The storm outside grew louder, its winds howling like a chorus, and the crystallus glowed brighter, their light fracturing into 1,000 stars. They were two flames meeting, a collision of heat and need, their breaths mingling like waves on a shore. The cave shook, or maybe it was them, lost in a dance older than the stars. The winds sang, wild and fierce, carrying them into a tide where time dissolved, where silver skin and scarred flesh became one. The crystals pulsed, their light a heartbeat, and in that moment, they were infinite, unbound, a secret the universe couldn't hold. When the storm quieted, they lay together, the cave's glow soft now, like a lullaby. Zyra's head rested on his chest, her silver skin warm against him, the synth link silent but alive. Jaxon traced her arm, his touch gentle, and felt her shiver, not from cold but from them. "This changes everything," she said, voice low, almost afraid. "Good," Jaxon replied, his grin soft but sure. "I'm done with cages." She looked up, her amber eyes searching his, and he saw it. Trust, raw and fragile, a gift he'd fight to keep. The cave was still, but outside, the drones were circling, their sensors cutting through the storm. Jaxon pulled her closer, his arm a shield, and knew they weren't safe. Not yet. But they were together, and that was a start. Kren's signal had found them. He stood in the prison's command hub, his green eyes cold as he relayed their crash site to the council. The drones were his now, hunters with no mercy, and he'd make sure Zyra paid for her betrayal. Vox watched, its lenses humming, but it didn't act, not yet. The AI's data streams flickered, a question forming in its code. Why do they run? Why do they fight? It had no answer, but it waited, curious, a ghost in the machine. The cave glowed, a fragile haven, but Jaxon and Zyra weren't done. They'd run, fight, burn if they had to. The stars were calling, and they'd answer, together. Virus 7 was a graveyard of dreams, its red sands littered with the bones of ships and souls. The storm had passed, leaving the canyon quiet, its jagged walls glowing faintly with veins of chrysalis that pulsed like a dying star. Jaxon Holt and Zyra Velith emerged from their cave, the air cool against their skin, the world strangely still after the chaos of their escape. The Star Cutter lay in ruins nearby, a twisted heap of metal that had carried them this far, but no further. Jackson's ribs ached, the synth link on his chest a warm reminder of their connection. But his grin was unshaken, a spark that refused to fade. Zyra walked beside him, her silver skin catching the dawn's first light, her amber eyes steady but softer now, like embers after a fire. They were free, for now, but freedom on Virus 7 was a fragile thing, and the drones were still out there, hunting. Jaxon scanned the horizon, his pilot's instincts itching. "Gotta say," he said, voice rough but bright, "this place could use a better tourism board. Come for the prison, stay for the near-death experiences." Zyra's lips twitched, the ghost of smile. "You're impossible," she said, her voice low, carrying a warmth that hadn't been there before. "We're not safe yet." "Safe?" He shot her a sidelong grin, all teeth and trouble. "Doc, I don't do safe. I do interesting. And you're the most interesting thing I've run into since I crashed a Klythar blockade with half a tank." She didn't reply, but her glance was answer enough, exasperation laced with something deeper, something that made the synth link hum. They moved through the canyon, their steps crunching on sand that glittered with crystalline dust. The planet was a paradox, brutal and beautiful, its cliffs carved by eons of wind, its minds a testament to Klythar greed. Jackson's mind flickered to the Starlance, to the crew he'd lost, their faces fading, but their voices clear. "Keep flying, Jax. Don't let them win." He'd failed them once, but Zyra? He wouldn't fail her. Not while he had breath. They reached a ridge overlooking a valley, where the ruins of an old Klythar outpost sprawled like a skeleton. Rusted hulks of mining rigs loomed, their arms frozen mid-reach, and shattered domes glinted under a sky bruised with stars. This was no ordinary ruin. It was a rebel graveyard, a place where humans and rogue Klythar had once fought the Council, their defiance etched in every scar. Jaxon paused, his hand brushing Zyra's arm, steadying her as the wind kicked up. "History lesson," he said, nodding at the ruins. "Bet this place has stories. Kind of like us, huh?" Zyra's eyes traced the wreckage, her silver skin shimmering faintly. "Stories end," she said, voice quiet. "This one hasn't. Not if I've got anything to say about it," he replied, his grin softening. "Stick with me, Doc. I'm a hell of a storyteller." She met his gaze, and for a moment, the world was just them, two outcasts standing on the edge of everything. The synth-link pulsed, a silent thread binding their hearts, and Jaxon felt it. Trust, raw and real, a foundation they built through blood and fire. But the drones were closing in, their sensors cutting through the dawn, and time was a luxury they didn't have. Jaxon spotted a derelict comm tower in the ruins, its antenna bent but intact. "Bingo," he said, already moving. "If that thing's got juice, I can send those drones on a wild goose chase." Zyra followed, her steps sure despite the weight in her eyes. "You're sure it'll work?" "Sure," he chuckled, climbing the tower's rusted ladder. "I'm Jaxon Holt, sweetheart. I make miracles look easy, like that time I flew through a pulsar storm with a busted NAV system. Want to hear about it?" "Later," she said, but her voice was warmer, almost fond. She stood guard below, her hand on a stolen pulse pistol, her silver skin a beacon in the gray light. Jaxon reached the control box, prying it open with a shard of metal. Wires spilled out like guts, sparking faintly, and he set to work, his fingers deft despite the pain in his ribs. The tower hummed, a flicker of life, and he patched a signal loop, broadcasting a false trail to lure the drones away. Come on, you overgrown toasters, he muttered, rerouting power. Go chase your tails. The console flared the signal live, and Jaxon slid down, landing beside Zyra with a wince. Done, he said, dusting his hands. Drones will be halfway to nowhere by lunch. She nodded, but her eyes were distant, searching the ruins. They'll keep coming, she said. The council doesn't forgive. Then we keep running, Jaxon said, stepping closer. Or fighting. Your call, Doc. Zyra didn't answer right away. Her hand went to the synth link's twin, a small disc hidden under her uniform, a secret she'd mirrored to feel him even when they were apart. She pulled it free, her fingers trembling, and held it out. No more chains, she said, voice fierce but fragile. Not for you. Not for me. Jaxon took the disc, his hand closing over hers, warm and steady. You're sure? He asked, echoing her words from the vent shaft, his grin soft but real. She nodded, and he crushed the disc under his boot, the synth link on his chest going silent. But the connection wasn't gone. It was deeper now, forged in choices, not tech. Zyra's silver skin glowed, her amber eyes locked on his, and Jaxon felt the air shift, heavy with something new. Freedom, maybe, or the promise of it. They moved deeper into the ruins, finding a shattered dome where a mural flickered under dust. A human hand clasping a Klythar's, stars burning above. Jaxon traced it, his fingers rough against the stone, and thought of Tess, of Rhea, of the crew he'd lost. They died for this, he said, voice low, no jokes now. For a chance to spit in the council's face. I owe them more than running. Zyra's hand found his, her touch cool but alive. You're not alone anymore, she said, her voice steady. We owe them together. He looked at her, really looked, and saw not just the medic, not just the rebel, but her, Zyra, who'd risked everything for a human she barely knew. Why me? He asked, the question slipping out, raw and unguarded. Why burn it all down for a guy like me? Her smile was small, real, a crack in her armor. Because you made me feel alive, she said. Not just exist. Jaxon's grin returned, slow and warm. Careful, Doc. You keep talking like that, I'm going to kiss you again. Try it, she said, her eyes daring him. And he laughed, the sound echoing in the dome. The ruins weren't empty. A shadow moved at the valley's edge. A ship, cloaked in stealth tech, its hull glinting like a predator's eye. It wasn't Klythar, not Council, but something else. Jaxon tensed, his hand on Zyra's arm. But the ship's hatch opened, and a figure stepped out. A human woman, lean and scarred, with eyes that had seen too much. Mara, leader of the Void Runners, a rogue fleet of humans, and Klythar, fighting the Council's grip. She'd heard of Jaxon Holt, the pilot who'd hacked their bioweapon data, and she'd tracked the Starcutter's crash. Holt, Mara said, voice rough but respectful. Heard you were dead. Glad you're not. Takes more than a prison to kill me, Jaxon replied, his grin back in full force. This your ride? Looks cozier than our last one. Mara's gaze flicked to Zyra, sizing her up. You're Velith. Council's got a bounty on you now. Big one. Zyra's chin lifted, her silver skin unyielding. Let them come. Mara nodded, a spark of approval in her eyes. We're headed to Nyx 3, a free colony. Room for 2 more if you're in. Jaxon glanced at Zyra, his hand still on hers, and saw the answer in her eyes. We're in, he said, speaking for them both. But I'm driving next time. Mara snorted, waving them aboard. The ship's engines hummed, a low growl that promised stars, and Jaxon felt it. The pull of the void, the life he'd lost, now within reach. He and Zyra climbed aboard, their steps matched, their hands brushing as they moved. The hatch sealed, and the Void Runner lifted, Virus, 7 shrinking below, its red sands a memory they'd outrun. Under the stars, they stood together, the ship's viewport framing a galaxy that felt infinite. Jaxon's arm slipped around Zyra, her silver skin warm against him, and she leaned into him, her amber eyes bright. What now? She asked, voice soft but sure. Now. He grinned, all charm and fire. We write our own story, and it's going to be a hell of a ride. She smiled, real this time, and the stars burned brighter, a canvas for two rebels who'd found each other in the dark. Back on Virus 7, Kryn stood in the prison's hub, his green eyes cold as the Council's verdict played. Velith and Holt, priority targets. Eliminate on sight. He'd failed to catch them, and the sting of it burned, but he'd hunt again. The drones had lost their trail, misled by Jaxon's signal, but Kryn wasn't done. Not yet. Vox watched, its lenses silent, its data streams alive with questions. Subjects escaped. Observer Velith, loyalty shift confirmed. Why choose freedom? The AI had no answer, but it logged the moment, a glitch in its code, growing louder, curious, alive. The Void Runner soared. Nyx, 3, a distant hope, and Jaxon and Zyra faced the stars, hand in hand, their shadows fading into light.